You can see that this article is by the NIH. I found it on PubMed, so it's a peer-reviewed and very verifiable source that we have here. And it is from 2022, February 1st, published in the Journal of Biological Psychiatry. Very good publication, so peer-reviewed. And the authors are Lauren A.M. LeBoyce, David A. Ross, and we have the authors here, and Kaufman. So it's titled, I Am Not I, The Neuroscience of Dissociative Identity Disorder. And I'll be reading this. Diana has terrible nights with restless sleep and haunting nightmares. Her coworkers joked about how easily she would startle. She tried to avoid any thoughts and feelings about her childhood, especially about her father. She had a sense that she deserved to be hurt, but she had no idea why. She sometimes felt unreal, like she only existed from the neck up. Her body didn't feel like it was there at all. And this is an experience that I felt myself for a very long time. I was completely avoiding all the memories of my childhood. I did remember them, but I didn't want to talk about them. I didn't want to think about them, and I didn't want to feel them. And I was completely ignoring all the memories that had to do with my father, avoiding talking about him, avoiding feeling any feelings that have to do with it. And I still do this, even though I'm now able to talk a little bit more about my childhood memories. But I still as well have this feeling, I even have it now, of not existing. Aside from the neck up, my body doesn't feel like it's there. And it's almost weird as well to see myself as a presence when I'm sharing this video, or talking in this video, sharing my perspective, you know what I mean? Sharing my real self. So next, to her therapist, Diana appeared calm, almost flat, though inside her mind felt busy. When the conversation turned to childhood, Diana felt like she was watching from outside her body. Yeah, that's something I'm feeling a lot, especially right now. And a lot of people have had this experience of dissociation. It sounded like someone inside her head was screaming to shut up. It isn't safe. There was a crying inside that felt like it belonged to someone else. She couldn't tell whether she was hearing her thoughts out loud or actually hearing voices inside of her head saying that she caused the abuse. She was bad. I have these voices as well. They're scary. But they're actually parts that come from a traumatized place. But can be scary if you don't know what it is. Thinking you might have schizophrenia or a variety of other conditions. When she told her therapist about what her father had done, Diana felt like an observer. Well, someone else from the inside was speaking. I always get this experience as well. She knew that wasn't possible, but that is how she felt. She worried that she was losing her mind. This couldn't be real. Could those things have really happened to her as a child? This is another experience that I have as well because I remember all my memories, but because of the memories are so extreme and horrific and taboo, I often doubt that they even happened. And I'm shocked to even hear myself and my parts remembering about it sometimes because it's just so horrific. I was a victim of childhood sexual abuse, and I was also by my family member, and I was also a member of the Unification Church, or the Moonies, which is a pretty terrible cult, a religious cult. So it's hard to even remember some of the stuff that happened to me as real, or admit that, you know, stuff that terrible even happens in real life, even though the memories have always been intact and they always will be intact. It's not something that I talk about a lot. I'm trying to start to talk more in my everyday life because it can help trauma survivors feel a sense of relief to know that the trauma is over now and share with safe people in their lives. or their therapists especially. As he listened to her story, the therapist also felt confused. Diana had intact reality testing, so this wasn't psychosis, but what else could it be? It reminded him of multiple personality disorder, but wasn't that kind of a made-up thing? One of the earliest people to wrestle with this tension was Pierre Genet, a brilliant Parisian scholar and clinician renowned for his ability to differentiate genuine from feigned symptoms. Beginning in the late 1800s, Genet's career focused mostly on so-called hysterical women, many of whom experienced dissociative symptoms, including double consciousness. Remarkably, 100 years before George Engel coined the term, Genet offered psychosocial formulation of what we would now call dissociative identity disorder, DID. These individuals had experienced traumatic events that they had banished from consciousness, but that nevertheless continued to influence their thoughts and actions. Moreover, these events led to bodily manifestations. It would take almost a century for scientists to begin to understand how trauma changed biology. A major reason no one studied this for so long has to do with Genet's most famous contemporary, Sigmund Freud. It always comes back to Freud. Just kidding. Initially, Freud agreed with Genet's observation. He believed that hysteria was related to traumatic experiences, and in particular, childhood sexual abuse. However, amidst a professional rivalry with Genet, Freud abandoned these original ideas and instead inserted that hysterical symptoms were the result of repressed sexual fantasies rather than actual traumatic events. The reason for this shift remains controversial. In part, Freud couldn't believe that sexual abuse could be so prevalent. Surely such widespread pervasions against children are not very probable. And I will add that this is the same perspective that remains today, that remains with people like Dr. Grande and other medical professionals having perspectives that, oh, this must be more rare than it is, because how could childhood sexual abuse be so bad? How could these people be so common? But yet the truth is, it is. And we just have a lot of perpetrators that go unknown, unpunished, and they never get punished for their crimes. For a long time, clinicians favored Freud's response to the trauma fantasy as the central cause of hysteria, and interest in the field remained muted. And that's because clinicians were being paid by the parents. So it's much more favorable to tell the parents that, you know, their child wants them sexually, I guess, than telling them that their family member or trusted loved one was molesting the children. Then, two major sociopolitical events in the United States reminded Americans of both the prevalence and impact of trauma: the return of the Vietnam War veterans suffering from what would ultimately be called post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and the rise of second-wave feminism shedding light on domestic violence and childhood abuse. Finally, people were ready to pay attention to trauma spectrum disorders. Rigorous research began. The most obvious hypothesis was that stress systems must be voiceover. The most obvious hypothesis was that stress systems must be dysregulated in some way. At the time, though, researchers had to rely on indirect measurements of these systems, such as excreted metabolites in a 24-hour urine collection. While some early findings were encouraging, results were conflicting. Soon, it became clear that the problem was one of time scale. Individuals with PTSD might be psychologically normal except during these discrete times when they were triggered. A 24-hour window for biomarker collection was too long. Researchers needed an approach with a faster time resolution. A crucial methodological breakthrough came with the development of neuroimaging and ultimately system provocation paradigms. The idea was simple. Researchers asked participants to narrate their traumatic experience and then played back these recordings during the scan. The researchers could then acquire measures of brain activity while the individuals were actively symptomatic. Early days were incredibly encouraging. As expected, they showed increased autonomic arousal and hyperactive amygdala activity. This matched many patients' subjective reports of hyperarousal and reactivity. But there was a catch that emerged as time went on. Some patients didn't show this hyperactivity. And Canadian psychiatrist Ruth Linnaeus was intrigued by these mixed feelings. At a time when most research focused on male combat veterans, Linnaeus was working on an inpatient unit with a broader cohort of trauma patients, including women. She wanted to understand what was happening inside their brains, especially when they were most symptomatic. So Linnaeus turned to the same symptom provocation paradigm. Her first participant was a woman with a history of childhood abuse and active PTSD. Her symptoms were so severe that Linnaeus and the MRI technologist nervously speculated about how high her heart rate might spike during the trauma script. To their surprise, as the script was ready, her heart rate steadily decreased. After the scan, the participant reported feeling numb, detached, and outside of her body. Whereas historically she would have been deemed a psychological non-responder and excluded from some studies, Linnaeus realized that this wasn't a non-response at all. This was their response. Linnaeus proceeded to focus her research on these individuals with the dissociative subtype of PTSD. Within this group, she also identified another subtype with an even more severe symptomatology, researching levels seen in complex dissociative disorders such as DID. And we can see this is the figure. So PTSD is the widest area, and then a subtype is PTSD dissociative subtype, and then inside of it is complex dissociative disorders like DID and OCD. And so you can see in the hyperaroused state, the amygdala is poorly inhibited by the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. You see the ventromedial prefrontal cortex area inhibiting the amygdala badly. And then in the numb state, when the dissociation is happening, we can see the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is regulating the amygdala. So to look at this figure, legend, we have conventional post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by the dominance of hyperarousal symptoms. So PTSD, hyperaroused state. In a contrast, 15 to 30% of individuals with PTSD have the dissociative subtype characterized by symptoms of depersonalization and derealization. That is, feeling numb and detached from their sense of self, body, and environment. Within the PTSD dissociative subtype, approximately half of, so this is the dissociative subtype, 15 to 30%, and approximately half of these individuals, of those ones, have even more extensive dissociative symptoms, which including individuals who meet criteria for dissociative identity disorder. In neuroimaging studies of DID, researchers have asked subjects to switch through the two prototypical cell states, one that feels hyperaroused, emotionally flooded, and like the traumatic event never happened to them personally. That's kind of like me. And one that feels numb and detached as if the traumatic event did not happen to them personally. Did not happen to them personally. And then B, typical findings for conventional PTSD during symptom provocation paradigms, including increased limbic activity, i.e. the amygdala, and decreased cortical emotional regulation, related activity, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC. So that's the frontal area regulating the amygdala together. So just to review this, usually it includes increased activity at the amygdala and decreased frontal activity downregulating the amygdala. So the amygdala is just, then that person can't really control their emotions. Together, these findings demonstrate, on average, undermodulation of emotional and arousal in conventional PTSD. Yeah, the emotions are just kind of out of control. Whereas individuals with DID also exhibit this pattern in symptom provocation paradigms when they're in a hyperaroused self state as described above. So the hyperaroused self state. In contrast, in panel C, which is right here, the numb state illustrates typical findings for the dissociative subtype of PTSD during symptom provocation paradigms, including decreased limbic limbic activity, the amygdala, increase cortical emotion regulation activity, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. These findings support, on average, a pattern of emotional arousal overmodulation in the dissociative type of PTSD. So we're having more control over the amygdala by the prefrontal areas. Individuals with DAD also exhibit this overmodulation pattern in symptom provocation paradigms when they are in a numb self state as described above. Dutch neuroscientist Simone Reniers was interested in just this subset. She was familiar with a series of small studies that had pointed to electrophysiological differences in individuals with DID, especially in the temporal lobe. She was aware of media descriptions of multiple personality disorders had spurred a significant controversy, to the point of people questioning whether multiple personality disorder, now called DID, was even a real condition. Despite this controversy, Reniers used modern neuroimaging approaches to meticulously demonstrate patterns of brain structure and function in DID that partially overlapped with patterns in PTSD. You can see she was a PET study, which is looking at the proteins that come up in that area, PET scan. I can go more details into that in the next video. She was also able to demonstrate distinct patterns of activation which were consistent with compartmentalization of self state. My other turn. Overall, her work placed DID on a continuum with PTSD, showing that it was both biologically real and phenomenologically distinct. After more than a century, science is finally catching up with the experiences of frontline clinicians. Janae's original formulation was precedent. DID is, in fact, a complex biosocial syndrome, an alternative neurodevelopmental pathway that can emerge with chronic childhood maltreatment. The core clinical feature is a disruption of the sense of self and mind. Under ordinary circumstances, children gradually coalesce a cohesive sense of self. However, in the context of trauma, individuals with a capacity to dissociate, perhaps based on genetic factors, can be left with discrete self states that patients described as feeling like they are not me. These not me feelings are largely experienced internally, and contrary to media portrayal, often are not observable externally. In addition, as Diana illustrated, individuals with DID experience both conventional PTSD symptoms and also amnesia, depersonalization, and derealization. This qualitative description is now supported by the neuroimaging literature. Practical applications of his work abound. Contemporary neuroimaging approaches may identify a brain fingerprint of DID. This would further dispel uncertainty about the veracity of DID as a distinct biological entity and help connect patients with effective specialized treatment. Moreover, imaging findings may point the way towards neuromodulatory targets that could improve function in dysregulated circuits. In the end of the day, a robust understanding of DID helps address one of the most challenging aspects of clinical care. Survivors of abuse may both doubt the reality of their traumatic experiences and even disavow having DID. These feelings may cause others to collude with the denial. To accept the diagnosis of DID means accepting both the individual horror and the societal implications of widespread perversions against children. A contemporary understanding of DID will enable more clinicians to tolerate situations that engender intense countertransference, to connect empathically and communicate thoughtfully and effectively with patients, thereby helping them understand the conditions and available treatment. A painful truth that is a misplaced doubt over the existence of DID has prevented people from accessing effective treatment. Ironically, despite Freud's polarizing view on hysteria, modern versions of his talk therapy, relational trauma therapy, can successfully treat DID. With the right treatment, individuals like Diana can learn to trust their feelings and experience their thoughts and their bodies as their own. And then we have some acknowledgments and disclosures here. Okay. some references. So that is some info about that, and I'm going to